Hello and welcome to this week's Politics Today, and in this programme today we'll be discussing the significance of the French presidential election and what it means for Britain. As we know that we're only a few days away from the second presidential vote that takes place on Sunday the 24th of April that will not only decide France's future but that of the entire European Union and also a Franco-Anglo relation. So in this programme today I'm joined by Melanie Simmons, the editor of Heart newspaper, together with Reverend Mark Whedon from Living Word Ministries. So welcome both back to the programme again. I'll start off with you, Melanie, before we discuss this very important French presidential election. I know that you have a new copy of Heart newspaper that's just come out recently. So share with us some of the major features and highlights of your paper for this edition.
Well, thank you, Simon. So, well, predictably we've gone for Ukraine, and I was very inspired by hearing Reverend Malcolm Heading recently on a Zoom call, and he gave some very good insights about the biblical background and God using a more wicked nation to judge a wicked nation, but we cannot judge, we have to be very careful ourselves. So we've got some slightly different views on Ukraine within the paper, on the background, spiritual background, and some of the factual stuff. We've also, and of course positive stuff too, that the churches are being filled to capacity. We've also got a piece inside, very good piece by Keith Malcolmson, his Russian Bible prophecy, which people are finding helpful, I believe. And also Charles Garden, of course, has come up Trump's Eye of the Storm. He has pointed out, keep an eye on a watch on little Israel, of course, because it's so easy with all that's gone on for the past 2 years to forget about Israel and take our focus off praying for her and her security. The whole, well, I'm sure you covered this in other programs, the whole Middle East situation, there's so many elements. But apparently, Russia has got their best tanks down in Syria. They've only got the 40-year-old ones in Ukraine. This is very interesting, yes.
Yeah, I don't think the Russian military is anyway match for Israeli high-tech weaponry. But anyway, that's another programme. And Mark, it's great to see you back on the programme. Share with us your thoughts on this French presidential election, because we see that President Emmanuel Macron is wanting to seek a second term, and no other French president has done that since Jacques Chirac, and that was back in 2002. So it's over 20 years since a French president has won a second term. He's campaigned very late on this, saying that he's above party politics, and he's too busy dealing with the situation in Ukraine and negotiating with President Putin. And then we've also seen a different Marie Le Pen from the previous one we saw back in 2017. So she's kind of learned some lessons. She's had documentaries with her and a cat to make her feel a little more warm and fluffy. And the big question is, has she thrown off those shackles of the National Front Party with some of the extreme far-right political ideology that is really girded her party? So these are the big questions. What are your thoughts on this French presidential election?
It is a very interesting election, and one that is also critical, I think, like you mentioned, about not only France but our own British-French relations and the EU as a whole. But it's a very polarised election, and you've got these extremes, or at least portrayals of extremes, and Macron sitting above it apparently, and he seems to be in a very strong position, and he certainly has been in the past. But there's a great deal of arrogance with the man, partly the lack of sort of electioneering and leaving things very late. But I was interested to see an interview with him in the Financial Times some time back, where he was not actually interviewed by the editors. He was just given a platform to speak out. And there was a man who really seems to have the spirit of Antichrist in him. And I think as Christians, as believers, we need to be aware of this. We need to be discerning, because that's how we can then pray properly. And we need to be praying for this election as well as for our own things in our own nation in Israel.
And Melanie, to put this in context for our viewers, that this is such a polarising election in France. So we have with President Macron, the current incumbent, seeking a second term is a globalist. He is one of the groomed leaders of the European Union, certainly since Angela Merkel's no longer on the scene. He is wanting to push for further European political integration. He's the main advocate for the support for the creation of a European army. And if he were to lose to Marie Le Pen, wouldn't this send a massive shockwave throughout the entire European Union, as the prospect of a French Frexit, as it were, would be definitely on the cards?
Yes, it would send huge shockwaves, and it would upset the establishment in the same way that the election of President Trump did, and the vote for Brexit upset the establishment. It was not meant to happen, and that's where I think the power of prayer and fasting by Christians came in. Quite a lot of us were led to pray and fast before President Trump was voted, not because he was for Trump, but I was just saying, please Lord, not Hillary, because I knew that her plan was to abort babies up to birth. With President Macron, what is really interesting is that, as you said, he's one of the groomed leaders of the European Union. He's one of Klaus Schwab's global young leaders, along with Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel, I think was slightly older, and Zelensky, of course, of Ukraine. And Klaus Schwab, of course, being the, I think he's the director or the president of the World Economic Forum in Davos, which has shaped a lot of recent events. And it would shock everyone if she got in, and the rather self-righteous arbiters of how we're supposed to think, say like the BBC, etc., would be shocked, and they would be probably go, hell for leather to attack her.
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask you, Mark, as well, is the global credentials of Emmanuel Macron. I mean, what was quite extraordinary in the last presidential election of 2017 really came from nowhere. His history is that he has been a banker with the Rothschild Bank. Then he became a minister under the previous French President Hollande, and then formed his own new party. The young people of France voted for him because he was young, he looked fresh and dynamic. But like he said, he's got a tendency of arrogance, which we know that his whole presidency was erupted with the yellow vests protest that lasted 5 months back in the November of 2019. He's introduced extreme pandemic measures to defeat the virus in France, which has alienated a lot of French people. And of course, people are worried about rising fuel costs, as like here in the UK, rising inflation, and also something about a loss of French identity in France under his presidency.
Yes, I mean, he's come out of nowhere, really, so very clearly groomed for it, just like Trudeau was, like Cameron was as well, actually, if we look at our own nation, and a very short time in national politics. And so there's somebody pursuing an agenda that ordinary people don't like. And there are populist uprisings in different countries. So America, Hungary, here we've had Brexit, France, the same thing. And people are reacting. And if we look at Pen, and you were touching on her sort of being perceived as being far right and some of those extreme things. If we look back 50 odd years or so, that would have been almost normal. But the definition has been changed, really, of what far right looks like. And immigration is a big issue that actually affects ordinary people to a very large degree. And so we're seeing all those things that affect ordinary people that they're struggling with, whereas the elitists don't have to worry about the finances, the bills, the issues there, because they just do what they like anyway, and they've got the money. So there could be a good swing if there is an honest way forward in the days ahead.
I'm in a dilemma, and I'm not afraid of saying that to our viewers as well regarding this French presidential election. On the one hand, I can see that if Macron wins a second term, it's full steam ahead with the European project and the creation of a European superstate, which he probably has ambitions to head up. So we know that Europe will go further into that political, economic and social integration. But with Marie Le Pen, she would put the brakes on it. So she's already stated that she wants France to be governed by her own rules, and that French law would surpass the laws of the European Union. She hasn't come out as radical as she did in the previous presidential elections of 2017, 5 years ago, where she called for Frexit, that France should come out of the European Union. But she's kind of hinted enough to say that she would make life extremely difficult for the European Union, and could actually introduce a referendum on France's membership of the EU, which would put the whole European project in jeopardy. So on the one hand, I'm also concerned with the underbelly of support that she has, that hold deeply anti-Semitic views, which is alarming. So it's a very difficult choice, for French Christians to actually make, and who they should put their vote for. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I completely agree, and I was just thinking earlier that some of the quite a lot of people in France might well just hold their nose and vote for Le Pen so as not to have Macron. And I was reading an article by an English journalist living in France in The Spectator, and his sister-in-law was in despair because she's a socialist, and she was saying, oh, not Macron, Le Pen again. Now, Le Pen has upped her game considerably. I completely agree about her supporters, but also the Muslim population of France would be alarmed. And they have very bad memories of French colonial rule. And although they live there now, I think they still see themselves as very much as outsiders. So that's another danger for them and for potential civil unrest, because I think last year there was some senior military figures who published an open letter warning of civil war in France. Now, at that time they were saying it would be Islamic militants. It may not even be those now, this is what the writer of the article was saying, because you've now got a divide in France between the haves and the have-nots, like Mark was saying about the elitists and everyone else. So it's the ordinary people, and Le Pen is very much identifying with them at this point, saying, look, you know, I understand you, I get it, which Macron can't do. He is seen as being perhaps someone who's never really had to muck in much and know how the common people feel. So it is a huge dilemma for the voters.
Of course, also interesting, just picking up on what Melanie has just said there, is the fact that Marie Le Pen is focusing on the rising cost of living in France, the increasing inflation and the increasing energy prices. It's always interesting when you look at our own kind of political issues are pretty much the same as they are on the continent as well. And this could play into the hands of Marie Le Pen, but also combined with that fact, it could be that the far left, who represent 20% of the vote in France, could swing their vote behind Marie Le Pen, which would then give her victory on Sunday, the 24th of April. How extraordinary would that be if the extreme left vote in what is considered the extreme right into power in the Champs-Élysées in France?
Wouldn't that be amazing, really, that they come together, which is probably an anything but Macron type of approach. And there is some validity to that, because if you think of energy prices, for example, as you specifically mentioned, I mean, the government has pursued a policy where there is a great deal of dependence on Russia for their energy. They should have been dealing with that decades ago, because it didn't take any sort of great political skill to figure out that there you've got an enemy, they're very, very wily, and you can't be dependent on key things. And so when prices go up and the ordinary people affected, they're going to have rumbles with that. And if the two sides come together, although the far left have been sort of instructed, as it were, not to have a single vote go to her, but it would upset the apple cart, and I think be probably healthy for changing the status quo.
I mean, Melanie, France is famous for the kind of French Revolution of 1789. I've got that kind of revolutionary spirit. And you've got to say that the way that President Macron has kind of governed, or governed France, has been to amass more power to himself than any other previous president going back to Napoleon's time. So, you know, with the French so supportive of their freedoms and their liberalism and their fraternity, you kind of question whether they would actually re-elect President Macron, knowing that during the lockdowns he introduced some of the most draconian measures than anywhere else in the world, obviously except Canada. That was the exception. But could we see a backlash against him come the second most crucial round of the French presidential election?
Yes, I think the backlash has already been seen, and that's why it's we're all having this debate and this comment, because there isn't much of a gap between him and Marie Le Pen. I mean, as we speak now, in the first round, he won 28% of the vote. She had 23%, only 5% difference. And according to an exit poll, which is supposed to be very accurate, according to Spectator, the alarming thing for Macron is his support is coming hugely from the over 65s. The only age group that he dominated was the over 65s by some margin, but Le Pen topped the age groups of the 35 to 64. They're the ones who are trying to raise families, forge a career, feel they've got some kind of future. So if Macron is, his strength is in the more, as you say, retired, affluent people and he's seen as a president for the rich or for the well-off. And as you're hinting at, he has more or less governed in a presidential style. And he's introduced these draconian measures. Now, that was fine for the over 65s who might be worried about their health anyway. But for the younger people, to curtail their freedom. I mean, I had a friend who lives in France. When he wanted to walk his dog in the forest during the lockdown, and it was the same in Greece, he had to fill in a form beforehand. In case you stop, what are you doing? You know, je promène le chien, and you know, here's my form. So to have that kind of control. Now, of course, we're not hearing about that in our mainstream media. They're not discussing that at all. But there was huge resentment, and I think that the people who are picnicking, the families who went and picnicked on the boulevard outside the cafes or restaurants that they couldn't go into because they weren't going to show a health pass, they are the people who might make the effort to go out and vote against Macron.
And Mark, one interesting aspect, of course, in this programme is how will the French presidential elections affect Britain? Now, we know with President Macron, he was an Anglophile when he took the presidency, but because the British people voted to leave the European Union, and since then we've got Brexit, he's turned very anti-Britain. He's certainly no fan of Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister. And we have the prospect there of France under Marie Le Pen of having their own referendum, their own kind of Euroscepticism dominating French politics, which would be more in line with Brexit. So in terms of Britain, wouldn't a more favourable outcome for Britain in terms of Anglo-Franco relations be if Marie Le Pen won the election? But I can't see that Boris is going to want to get that close to her because of how we would be seen and how we would be associated.
Yes, I can see that. I think it would be helpful, more helpful if she were to win on the 24th, even though she's toned down her Frexit sort of ambitions. But anything that's less European is going to help us and make life easier in terms of trade and politics. But yeah, I don't either see Boris and her sort of cozying up politically. But that's probably a good thing, really. You know, God made the nation state, and I think this is what we need to come back to, and he is the one who thwarted the Tower of Babel, and so that should be our kind of a way forward in terms of our prayers.
Absolutely. And Melanie, one of the big issues that has dominated France in recent years is the role of Islam within France, and considering the large numbers of Islamic immigrants from the likes of Algeria and North Africa into France has kind of changed the whole nature of France and its communities. And one of the big issues, I think, for a lot of French voters, like it was in our last election, is the issue of immigration. And asking questions in light of all the kind of ISIS terrorist attacks that France witnessed really from about 2015 all the way through to about 2017-18 was the fact, is this compatible with France? And of course this has sparked a massive debate. So on the one hand we see that Marine Le Pen in the last presidential elections really campaigned on the Islamic issue and the immigration issue. This time she seems to have completely toned down her message. And on the one hand, we're seeing the hypocrisy of Macron. On the one hand, he's saying that Islam is not compatible with French values and has to be reformed, and that the Muslims should have their own kind of reformation. But also linked to this is the fact that under his watch, he's allowed a massive wave of immigration from Islamic countries into France. So how do you think that will all play out?
With difficulty. I mean, with what's happened recently, it's taken us all by such been a surprise, but there were people being prophesying, people like David Hathaway years ago, warning about the immigration into Europe. And the people who came in as sleepers and set up terrorist cells, they're still there, they haven't gone anywhere. They're just waiting to be activated. We've taken our eyes off that. What is interesting is Marie Le Pen's slogan is on Twitter is pour tous les Français, for all the French. So she's trying to be inclusive. And I suppose if you were a Muslim family or part of a Muslim family and you're worried about the cost of living, which would you vote for? You know, if you thought that she was going to tolerate you and, you know, you could just carry on earning a living, etc., then you might well vote for her. But there have been very high numbers of abstentions, which is a big concern for Macron's campaign, because people are more likely to turn out to vote, so we say, out of anger and passion than for more of the same and someone who is a centrist.
Yeah, and we see really that, Mark, that the only real tactic left for Macron is the negative campaigning. The dangers of Marie Le Pen becoming president, what that would mean for France, what that would mean for the French economy, for the French society, and also France's role within the European Union and the world. I mean, that's essentially what he will actually do, and this is what he'll be campaigning on. But the thing is, the French people know what to expect from him now, don't they, after 5 years? Before he was the fresh-faced, up-and-coming young leader of France, he was then also the youngest leader since Napoleon. So that had a resonance with the French voters. But come this election, do you think that the French people might actually say, let's go for change?
I think many will want to go for change. They've seen the effects of what Macron has brought in, and so all the glamour is gone and the reality is hit. And with something like immigration, for example, I mean, it's easy for him to be negative and accuse Le Pen, but actually some questions need to be asked, because it's not just about racism. There are practical realities of different cultures, assimilation, the realities of, you know, people's expectations and how it fits or doesn't fit, and clearly it doesn't fit. And so we do have, or they have, all those social unrest problems, and somebody's got to try and resolve it in some sort of way. So they may well be looking to give somebody else a chance. And I think it might be a good question for Macron himself to be asked, don't you think it'd be good for France to have a female president?
Absolutely. Oh, I didn't even mention that. I mean, that's also extremely significant, isn't it, that that Mark has raised, that in Marie Le Pen, France may have its first female president in its history.
Yes. It would be quite an achievement, and it would be very interesting. Like as with Mrs. Thatcher, she came from a conservative background rather than a socialist. I know they've had previous presidential candidates who tried, like Ségolène Royal, I think, and they got one or two French mayors, I think. But it would be interesting if it was a woman, but that's not the whole picture, of course, as we know. It would be her policies, and she would need, I was thinking, massive security, not because she's a woman, but because of her policies and the danger that she would be in. Just not only, say, you know, being possibly anti-Muslim or being perceived as that, but also anti-establishment. She could be in great danger, actually, if she won.
And Mark, what's also interesting is they say about, for example, about Macron is the fact that not only has he amassed more powers than any other president before him, but the way that he kind of views himself and also views the world as well, that he has a divine right to the Elyee Palace. And the one interesting thing as well that political commentators say about France is the fact that the French president has more executive power than any other leader in the Western world, in the kind of democracies. And what's so interesting, having seen the French presidential system and the way that France operates at first hand, it seems that the French people can have influence over France's domestic policy, but there is absolutely no way to have any influence whatsoever on French foreign policy. And there are only two nations that are driving the European project. That's Germany, who's driving the economy, and France is in control of the EU's foreign policy. What if Marie Le Pen won the keys to the Champs-Élysées? Do you think then this could actually change and that we could see a different French foreign policy that has been pretty much unchangeable with the various prime ministers going back over the last couple of decades?
Yes, I think it would change, but obviously there are different areas of this. I mean, Israel has been mentioned already, and both of them pretty anti-Israel. And politics is always a choice, really, between the lesser of two evils. But because she's not a New World Order protege, that really is going to help in terms of, again, a nation state slightly better for Britain, even if not all that we would like to see. And so a change is probably a good thing, because more of the same, we know exactly where that's going to go. And she will put us a little bit of a break on these things.
Melanie, going to the last final 2.5 minutes of the programme, how should our viewers be praying for the French presidential elections, and why should we pray? Mostly we see what's going on in France, this is across the channel. Why should we bother here in Britain? But I think it's important to pray for this, because the future of France is at stake, but also that of the entire European Union, and also Anglo-Franco relations.
One would be exposure of the truth. I mean, as you mentioned, the potentially the anti-Semitic background of some of Le Pen's supporters, but also there's a scandal which we haven't mentioned yet, which is being called McKinsey Gate, and that is the management consultants McKinsey stand accused of having funded and shaped Macron, almost invented him, and they are being used across other countries to promote a certain narrative, and that has gone on, you know, for the past 2 years or more since Macron was elected. So that we should pray that that is exposed and the French voters know about it. It's not being reported here. I doubt it will be, except on alternative media. But that is a very, very big concern. Lots of taxpayers' money in France being used to fund this kind of thing. Macron is also on a secretive Health Defence Council, which is where they decide what they'll do with the taxpayers' money. We don't know anything about that. So it would be wise to pray, perhaps, for the enemy's plans to be held back. I do believe that with what's happened in the last 2 years, the words of a prophetic intercessor I respect a lot said that the enemy had tried to bring in the end-time scenario too soon. And with the election of, say, Orban in Hungary and possibly of Le Pen in France, things could be held back and give us a longer window for evangelism.
Mark and Melanie, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's Politics Day as we discuss the French presidential election. I want to thank you for watching this week's programme. Just a reminder that it's the French presidential election second round is only days away, and we could see the biggest political earthquake to happen on the continent of Europe for generations if Marie Le Pen were to win the keys to the Champs-Élysées and become France's next president, and also next woman president. But we also could see that Macron could just scrape in and win a second term and push ahead with his global ambitions to create a European superstate. So much is at stake, so much is going on. That's why we've got to continue to pray and be vigilant in these times. So thank you for watching this week's Politics Today.